2 weeks ago, when I was visiting my mother in Florida, you had the Reverend Canon Linda Taylor come and share the word with you. And Linda had retired here to Fort Worth from California. She and I had a mutual friend from the time I was in Miami, from 1999 to 2002. Mary Gray Reeves was a priest in the Diocese of Southeast Florida, who later became bishop in the Diocese of El Camino Real in California, near the San Jose area. And Linda was on her staff, so it was really great to talk about those old times and stories, and to have Linda to be with us a couple weeks ago. When she was here, she preached about Peter, and she asked us to look at the baptismal covenant. I'm going to ask you to pull out your prayer book and turn to page 304 and 305, if you don't mind. As you remember, we do this every baptism and often at the Easter Vigil. And I won't go through all of these questions. I just want to point out question 4 and 5, which is actually on page 305, right before the prayers for the candidates. Linda talked about seeking and serving Christ in all persons. We heard the reading today about love our enemies. Linda also talked about respecting the dignity of every human being. Last week, Father Christopher, our curator and assistant rector, preached about trust and about vulnerability and how it takes risk to be vulnerable, to be in a community, and to love each other as Christ loved us. Today I want to take that a little further, and I want to talk about forgiveness, a topic that we all have some familiarity with, I'm imagining. The need to forgive or to ask for forgiveness. And the story in the first reading about Joseph is, to me, almost a penultimate act of forgiveness. But I want to go back and give a little bit of context in the historical narrative about the time when this is going on. But I want to go back a little further to Joseph's great-grandfather, Abraham. If you remember back in Genesis, we have Abram and Sarai, whose name is changed to Abraham and Sarah. And when there's a name change in ancient Israel, it's a very significant thing. It often means entering into a covenant. And so we have that name change. And this is around the year 1850, before the Common Era. And if you remember the story, Sarah was not able to have children, and so they suggested that Abraham lay with Hagar, the slave mistress, which he did, and they had a baby, Ishmael. And then about 12 years later, the angel of the Lord came to visit and said to Sarah, "You're going to have a baby." And what did she do? She laughed. And so their son, Isaac, literally means she laughed. There's a very significant thing in the naming in ancient Israel, just like in the native tradition, indigenous tradition. So she laughed, and then they had the baby Isaac. And so let's go back to Hagar for a second. So Sarah got jealous, a very human condition that we've all experienced, I'm sure. And she goes to the point of banishing Hagar and Ishmael from their camp. And they wander the desert for a long time, and Hagar is not wanting to watch her child suffer and die, and so she goes away, and yet all of a sudden God opens up a pool of water. And in the Islamic tradition, that's called the Zamzam well, which is located just outside of Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And so when Muslims go on the Hajj, one of the 5 pillars, if they're able to go on the Hajj, they go, part of their experience is then to go out to the Zamzam well and throw rocks at the devil. And so there's a great connection between Hagar and Ishmael, and some consider Ishmael to be the father of Islam. And of course, the Prophet Muhammad doesn't come until many years later in the 7th century. So we have that lineage with the common patriarch Abraham. Then we have Isaac, the Jewish lineage, and Christianity comes out of Jewish lineage in Hellenistic Greek world. But we all have the same patriarch, Abraham. And we consider our Jewish sisters and brothers and Muslims to be our cousins. And so, you remember the story then about Isaac grows up and he marries a woman named Rebekah, whom he saw in a well, and they have two kids, Esau, which means red hairy one. He had a very red hair, and today we call it, someone might call that a ginger. And then they had another son, the second son, Jacob, or Yaakov, really, in the Hebrew. And he was named because that means holding on to the heel, or one who supplants. You remember he was trying to pull his brother back into the womb so he could be born first to receive all the inheritance, and he tricks his brother over a pot of stew and steals his birthright. And then Jacob marries Leah, and what goes around comes around, that little trick there that Laban, Rebekah's brother, did, Jacob's uncle. And he marries Leah and then Rachel and has children, and with two more kind of slave women as well. And now we get to the cover of our bulletin, our friend Joseph. Now, Jacob favored Joseph, and we're not supposed to favor our children. We're supposed to love them all equally the same. I remember when I was a kid, three of us would ask our parents, who do you love the most? And they love you all equally the same. I remember that phrase over and over and over. But Jacob favored Joseph and gave him a beautiful coat of many colors. Joseph in the Technicolor dream coat. Anybody see that play on Broadway or a movie and all that? And so, yes, he got a little cocky with that coat and was prancing around and all that kind of stuff. And his brothers got jealous. There's that jealousy again, just like Sarah. And so they are going to teach him a lesson, as sometimes big brothers do, although I think they went a bit extreme. And they took him out, took his coat, threw him in a pit, put some blood on it of an animal, said to Jacob, your son is dead. I mean, there's sibling rivalry, but there's sibling rivalry, right? And he's devastated, as anyone could be, the death of a child. And then some people come and they sell him down into slavery. The Midianites take him down into Egypt, and he becomes a slave in Potiphar's house. Potiphar is the captain of the guards of the Pharaoh. So a pretty nice house, a pretty high-ranking thing, and he's there. And then he meets Potiphar's wife. And it says in the Bible that Joseph was ruddy and handsome. And so she took a liking to him and wanted to lay with him. And he said no, being a good employee. And then, in order to save face, and she says that he tricked her and wanted to do, she reversed the roles. And Potiphar, to save face with his wife, has to send him to prison. One wonders if he really knew what was going on there with his wife. So nonetheless, he's in jail. And all the time when he was over there in Israel, he could have this gift of interpreting dreams. And so he's now there in jail, and there are a couple people in jail with him, and they talk about their dreams, and he tries to interpret it. And one of them is about a baker, and I can't recall the other one. It sounds like Candlestick Maker, but I think that's a song, so everything is the Candlestick Maker. The baker is someone else. Then word gets to Pharaoh that he can interpret dreams, so Pharaoh says, well, bring this guy to me. I want to tell him about my dream. And he said, I saw 7 skinny cows eating 7 fat cows. What does that mean? And he said, well, that means we're going to have 7 good years of grain and all that, and then 7 years of famine. Oh, okay. Well, we better then save some grain every year so that during the bad times we can have food. And so during the time of famine, which is our story today in Genesis chapter 45, the folks, Jacob's sons, went down to find grain in Egypt, and they met with this kind of chief of agricultural person, Joseph, and he recognizes his brothers, and a little before our chapter, he flees and weeps in the other room. And he comes, and they go back and come back and talk about another son named Benjamin. And then what does it look like Joseph's doing in the front of our cover? Embracing his brothers. The brothers who sold him into slavery, threw him out in a pit. Joseph chose love over revenge. Joseph chose love over hate. Joseph chose love over anger. Joseph chose love over indifference. Joseph chose love. Our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, says, if it's not about love, it's not about God. Now, I know we all have stuff. I have stuff that I need to forgive or ask for forgiveness. And one of my relatives I had talked to and apologized for something that was perceived to be something that I needed to apologize for. And I felt after reflecting on it that I did, and I did apologize. And I thought that we were okay. But just like the little ember in the fire that you think is out, and we all have that, don't we? So because I love my relative and I want to be in relationship with my relative, then I'm going to need to go back and do some work again to have this relationship reconciled. Now, I could just say, well, you know what, I did that, I'm done. That's your issue. But no, my relative, blood relative, is important to me because I love my blood relative. So I'm going to need to do some work in order to have that relationship reconciled so that it's a relationship of love. Now, during life, especially as we grow up and get out of our younger years, we have a choice. We can carry around the heavy buckets of resentment and hate and anger, or we can turn to Jesus Christ to help us to put down those buckets, to pour out some of that stuff in our buckets, to ask God to change what's in our buckets. And sometimes we've had these buckets so long that it's almost become calcified in our own soul and in our own heart. Hardened heart. And sometimes our pride keeps us from trying to work on that stuff in our buckets. But in the Gospel of Luke, it says, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. But love your enemies. I wouldn't call my relative an enemy, but do good. Expect nothing in return. Your reward will be great. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Sometimes we need to forgive people who we share the same bed with, or the same surname, or someone who may be gone into the next life, where we cannot have that dialogue, but that we have to, in a way, somehow reconcile with the memory of what we might perceive as an injustice. And we have a choice in the matter because we're not robots, right? We have a choice of how we handle it. With Joseph saying that all of this was God's plan to preserve Israel during a time of famine, one might wonder if that was not the case, if Joseph would have still made a choice to love his brothers. Of course, they might not have ever met them because they may not come down, but you never know. Forgive and you will be forgiven. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back. We probably all have a little bit of that calcification. You might be thinking of a particular individual right now that you might need to forgive or ask to be forgiven. I want to share with you a quote by Archibald MacLeish, as you may remember, who was an American poet and writer associated with the Modernist School of Poetry, who was also, during FDR's time, the Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs, and later the 9th Librarian of Congress. And he once said that religion is at its best when it makes us ask hard questions of ourselves. The hard work. It's at its worst, religion's at its worst, when it deludes us into thinking that we have all the answers for everybody else. So, my paradigm and my story is my story. Your paradigm and your story is your story. We all walk in our own moccasins. But I bet you that at least over half of us have some work to do in the field of forgiveness. And Thomas Merton, the great Christian monk, said, "Our job is to love others without stopping to inquire whether or not they are worthy." Our job is to love others. And isn't it a lot easier to love than to hate? I remember one of my students in Miami, the 8th grader, she was all upset one day in ethics class. I said, "Well, what's going on?" She said, "Well, I'm mad at so-and-so." And I said, "Well, what did she do?" "Well, she stole my boyfriend, and I hate her." And I said, "Well, that wasn't very nice to steal your boyfriend." You know, 8th grade girls. I was like, "Okay, here we go." And I said, "So let's talk." "Well, that wasn't very nice. And I hate you." I said, "Do you really hate her? Deep down inside, do you really hate her?" "Well, no, but I'm upset." "Well, you have a right to be upset. Absolutely. That's your boyfriend." For 5 minutes. But do you want that inside of you? Do you want that coming out of you? Hate. "Well, no, I don't think I really do." I said, "Okay." I said, "Well, words are powerful. Maybe next time let's think of a different word." Some of us probably have some hard work to do in the field of forgiveness. So this week, I'm going to ask you to think and pray about where some of that calcification might be in your life, in your heart, in your soul. And to try to move from a place of resentment, anger, holding on, pride, to a place of love and forgiveness. Because everyone is worthy of forgiveness. And everyone is worthy of love. And so I want to close with a prayer, if you don't mind joining me, as we offer this up to God to help us think about the particularities of this prayer in our own context. O Lord, enlighten in each of us what is dark. Strengthen in each of us what is weak. Mend in each of us what is broken. Bind in each of us what is bruised. Heal in each of us what is sick. And lastly, revive whatever peace and love has died in us, so that we may choose you and choose love always. Amen.